So I think we can agree that the world is a giant flaming ball of shit. We all know that. We all get that. We all have our own ideas of how it got there. What we're trying to do with this channel is to divorce ourselves from that dichotomous knee-jerk way of thinking and try to form opinions on solid ground that allow us to understand nuanced arguments and opinions, because things are not as simple as they seem. Inherently, we know that, but we like to go back to this idea that things are either black or white, on or off. So with this channel at Rumination Nation, we like to really get our hands dirty and try to figure out why things are the way they are. Or we just drive ourselves into a pit of despair and frustration and never leave the house and never talk to anybody. Either way, let's just try to keep it light and airy. That's what we like. So this is part 2 of the Great Party Switch. I think that's what I'm going to be calling it now. In part 1, we went over the fact that it's been Democrats who were traditionally the ones who were against massive immigration, and they wanted to put tighter restrictions on it. And Republicans really were the ones who wanted more open borders. And that was because it allowed for lower wages, higher profits. It looks better on the bottom line. And we saw that Democrats actually did gradually shift in terms of economic policy. And even, we're not going to talk about it in this video, but in foreign policy too. No matter who you vote for, the debt keeps going up and the bombs keep falling. So what happens if Democrats start to align with Republicans on the economy and foreign policy? How could this happen without anybody really seeming to notice? How do Democrats hobble together a coalition to compete in elections? These are the questions that we're going to try to tackle in this video. And in order to answer these questions, I should start off with a little bit of a framework. See, during the Reagan years, there was this idea that national politics were a three-legged stool. On the first leg, you have the most important leg, and that's the economy. This is the one that wins and loses elections because ultimately people are worried about putting food on the table, paying the bills, making sure the rent and the mortgage are paid, taking care of their kids. That's going to be priority number 1. James Carville said it's the economy, stupid, and he knew what he was talking about. You can't fake the economy. You can't fake economic outcomes, although they've tried to. The problem is not a lot of people get granular in their understanding of the economy. They just know if things are good or they aren't good, and if they aren't good, it's just time to switch horses. The next leg is the foreign policy and defense leg. This is, again, not a very interesting, sexy topic. 2004, 1968, and 1952, when we had wars going on, these things really didn't matter much in terms of electoral outcomes. The third and final leg is social issues. These are the things that everyone has an opinion on and can get really riled up about. You ask the average Joe walking down the street the differences between Austrian and Keynesian economics, they're probably going to give you a blank stare. You ask them about marriage equality or abortion, they're going to have opinions, and they're going to be passionate and specific opinions. These issues really don't have a lot of sway in presidential elections. Congressional elections, sure, but they tend to take all the air out of the room during election time anyway. And that's because of the media. The media is a business, and they make their money through subscriptions and views and clicks. The way to get those things is through inciting people and getting them all worked up. I like to call it engagement through enragement. This is how boring but extremely consequential legislation gets passed. Things like, NAFTA and welfare reform and the repeal of Glass-Steagall. They get passed without a ton of pushback. These things are just boring, so the media really doesn't talk about them that much. And therefore, the average person on the street really doesn't even pay attention to them. This problem got a lot worse during those magical years of 2008 to 2012, when social media like Facebook and Twitter were growing exponentially, and everyone was making a transition from dumb phones to smartphones. Remember this graph from the first video? You can see things really starting to fall apart at this time. Here's another graph of showing the rise of mental health disorders. This time was basically when we all got linked together in this dysfunctional, angry hive mind, where outrage is disseminated through the population at the speed of light. Everyone now has quick and easy access to the public square to scream and shout their often misinformed opinions from the comfort of their own toilet. So now you can be outraged, and you can spread that outrage to others. You can seek out others who are similarly outraged and call them friend, and find others who aren't outraged and call them enemy. This is getting back to our primitive tribal roots, to a time when survival was a group activity and you needed the tribe, and you needed to constantly affirm your position in that tribe. If you get kicked out, you're on your own and at the mercy of the rival, the outsider, the other. We can't underestimate how big a role social pressure plays in forming our opinions, and to a huge extent, even our realities. Think about your own life. I'm sure you've seen families and friendships fracture over politics. And if you're over the age of, say, 30 or 35, you probably remember a time when it wasn't nearly as bad. A little over a decade ago, you could disagree with someone politically and still grab a beer with them and sit down and enjoy Thanksgiving dinner. Now we have a growing number of people who are perfectly willing to tell grandpa to go fuck himself because he agrees with Trump on NAFTA. position that the grandkid would have been all for had they not been gaslit and manipulated into thinking a different way. I remember this episode of Bill Maher, I think it was Van Jones, talking about how, one person looks up a yoga mat and the algorithm labels them a liberal, and another person looks up a truck and they're labeled a conservative. And from that point on, they're fed tailor-made content that enrages and excites them. A few years down the road, they think each other is a dim-witted lunatic. But if you take a look at their phones, they're just living in completely different universes. And this is backed up by data. There's a 2018 Pew Research study that found people expressing consistently liberal or conservative views had doubled in the last 20 years. And the middle ground, where people had a mix of views, disappeared. In 1994, you had 49% of Democrats that were more conservative than the median Republican, and 30% of Republicans were more liberal than the median Democrat. By 2017, those numbers are basically at zero. This isn't a natural, healthy evolution. This is propaganda at work, and it's coming from both sides. While I can't dismiss a secret conspiracy, at least I don't think I can, the algorithm explains a lot of why the same event or policy can be viewed in radically different ways, depending on your feed, which in turn depends on your tribe, which in turn reinforces or enforces your reactions or views on a given topic. Maybe you know deep down, or you remember, like, immigration has adverse effects on wages, and enforcing these laws are a good thing. But expressing those views can mean losing friends, and it's just easier not to. Maybe there's a policy that you didn't give much thought to, and your friends all have the same stance on it, and aligning with them just feels better because questioning it or looking into it is going to have consequences. The social cost of not aligning is too high, and the validation and camaraderie from aligning feels too good. The end result is we come away with strong opinions and beliefs that feel grounded because they're grounded in social affirmation, but they aren't tied to reality. This is something called objective-subjective drift. That's where the subjective view on an issue drifts away from the objective facts that back it up. Now, there's a lot I can say on it, but I'm not going to get too into it in this video. So let's just move on. In the first video of this series, I showed you that Bernie clip where Ezra Klein was interviewing him, and Bernie gave a very concise explanation of why Democrats have been for stricter immigration. Most people I've showed that clip to immediately claimed it was fake. And these are people who voted for Bernie in 2016. They either didn't notice it, didn't realize it, but their stance on immigration drifted far away. Those people had deeply held beliefs that Bernie was an open borders guy. Those beliefs were not actually grounded in reality, but a false perception. If you remember, back when Trump authorized the, kidnapping of Maduro, the following 48 hours had people taking to the streets acting like he was some kind of folk hero that needed to be freed for the good of the Venezuelan people. But if you paid attention on social media, there were a ton of Venezuelan people who were cheering it on, and they were horrified at the fact that people were showing up in the streets in America chanting and wanting Maduro out. These people took to the streets. Their intentions were well-meaning. I'll give them the benefit of the doubt, but they really didn't have a solid grasp on the situation. It was just pure reflex. Angry, bad orange man does something, we have to oppose it, which kind of makes me wonder, what else could Trump get people to be for or against? Anyway, after much rumination on this topic, the only thing I can explain it with is a social media feed that's crafting a false reality and confirmation bias and social pressure that just makes us go along with whatever the tribe says. I may have wandered off a bit here, but it's really important to understand this because there's really no other way to understand how our political parties have accomplished this drastic switch in stances without their most voters even noticing it. So to get back to the politics and to the 2016 election, which I wanted to highlight in this video, I want to do a little thought experiment. Now, imagine you have a presidential race and candidate A, who is dedicated roughly 70% of their campaign ads to policy, and policy they spoke about, and policy that they're talking about is economic. Remember the three-legged stool and how the economy is the one that wins elections? Then you have candidate B, they dedicate the vast majority of their ads to just ad hominem attacks on their opponent and are almost avoiding talking about any policy whatsoever. Now, what conclusions could you draw from that? You could probably say that candidate B isn't really a serious candidate at all. You could probably say that candidate B ain't going to win, maybe even conclude that they shouldn't win. Now, I want you to think about that in terms of the 2016 election and which candidate, A or B, best correlates to Clinton or Trump, just going by your memory and perception. Now, I bet a lot of people kind of reflexively said that Trump was obviously the one who was launching all the attacks through their ads, and Clinton was the one that was deeply steeped in policy. But according to the Wesleyan Media Project that studies the use of media in campaigns, you'd actually be wrong. To read from the abstract of their study, it says the 2016 presidential campaign broke the mold when it comes to political advertising. Using data from the Wesleyan Media Project, We show that the race featured far less advertising than the previous cycle, a huge imbalance in the number of ads across candidates, and one candidate who almost ignored discussions of policy. That candidate who ignored discussions of policy, they go on to point out, it was actually Hillary Clinton. If this isn't how you remember the campaign going down, it might be because you're trapped in a little bit of an algorithmic bubble that really didn't allow you to see the objective reality. Now, you're not alone. This example demonstrates two things. One is just how these algorithms influence our perceptions, and two, gets us back on track to answer one of the questions I promised that this video would. What happens when the party starts aligning with the other on economic and foreign policy, the two most important legs of that stool I was talking about? Well, you lean hard on the third leg. Republicans found themselves in a similar scenario in the 90s, and it worked for them, and it's a play that the Democrats have pulled 20 years later. Bill Clinton was a hugely popular president, and on economics, NAFTA, welfare reform, the repeal of Glass-Steagall, budgets balanced through spending cuts, these are not left-wing policies. They were centrist to right-wing, business-friendly policies that pulled a ton of moderates away from the GOP. Now, the Republicans had a problem. Their economic pitch of deregulation and free trade and trickle-down, it was being co-opted, at least on a national level. If you wanted those things, you just voted for Democrats. So the GOP, led by Newt Gingrich, made their contract with America, which was a complete reorientation of strategy. Gingrich understood if you can't win on economics, you win on culture. You make every election a referendum on values and identity, on who the real Americans are. In 1990, he circulated a memo titled Language, a Key Mechanism of Control, and told his fellow Republicans to use words like decay and sick and traitorous and corrupt to describe Democrats, kind of like the words Nazi and fascist are used to describe Republicans today. Gingrich taught Republicans to stop debating policy and start demonizing opponents. Starting to see anything familiar? Fast forward to 2016, Democrats, with the exception of a few like Bernie, are completely unwilling to talk about the economy in any specific way that threatens their corporate donors. So they make it about values and morals and character, make it about who the good people are and who the bad people are. Don't let them turn the conversation back to trade or wages or the banking regulations. By this time, the party's top donors weren't trade unions, they were Wall Street and Silicon Valley. The Center for Responsive Politics documented in the 2016 cycle, Clinton raised over $1 billion from the securities investment industry, lawyers, lobbyists, and the tech sector. Not people who want to hear a whole lot about breaking up banks and renegotiating trade deals. So how do you keep the donor class happy while trying to keep enough of your working class base to win an election? You have to reframe the issue as a moral one. As demonstrated in the first installment of the series, Democrats were very comfortable talking about immigration restrictions because it was an economic issue that controlled the supply of labor, and it benefited the working and middle class. But once your donor base shifts to people wanting open borders because they want cheap labor, you can't make that economic argument anymore. You have to reframe it as a moral issue. It's about who we are as a country. It's about compassion, and anyone who raises an economic argument against it isn't just wrong, they're a bad person, and you shouldn't even listen to them. Would you listen to Hitler? No way. You plug your ears up and run away. When Bernie Sanders ran against Clinton in the primary, he was still talking about these things, and the establishment just wanted him to shut up. They tried to label Bernie as a racist and sexist for focusing on these issues, and the issues themselves were framed as racist and sexist. Now, I want you to take a look at this clip of Hillary Clinton campaigning in, I believe it was a union hall.
Everything is about an economic theory, right? If we broke down the big banks tomorrow, that's it will. If they vote against systemic risk, I will. Would that end racism? Would that end sexism? Would that end discrimination against the LGBT community? Would that make people feel more welcoming to immigrants overnight?
Now that strikes me as someone who really doesn't want to talk about these things and is trying desperately to make people think racism, sexism, all that kind of stuff is a greater threat to their quality of life than jobs in the economy. When she talked about breaking up the big banks, it was qualified with this half-hearted, like, oh, I'll break them up, believe me, if they pose a risk. Well, who decides if they actually pose a risk? Now, Democratic political strategist Roy Texiera wrote a piece for The Atlantic in, I believe, 2022, where he references this exact clip. He says, after Sanders unexpectedly came close to tying Clinton in the Iowa caucus, she went on the offensive, seeking to characterize Sanders' class-oriented pitch as racist and sexist, as NBC News reported at the time. Not everything is about the economic theory, right? Clinton said, kicking off a long interactive riff with a crowd at a union hall this afternoon. Now, the problem with this is that they were so invested in this narrative of good and bad and really trying to distance themselves from the populist economic message that Bernie had. Even after the election was lost, you had so many people in the postmortem saying that it was because of racism and sexism that people voted for Trump. Texiera goes on in the article. He says the rigorous accounting of vote shifts toward Trump, however, shows that they were concentrated among white voters, particularly those without college degrees, with moderate views on race and immigration, and not among white voters with high levels of racial resentment. Political scientists Justin Grimmer and William Marble concluded that racial resentment simply could not explain the shifts that occurred in the 2016 election. In fact, Trump had fewer votes from white voters with high levels of racial resentment than Mitt Romney did in 2012. So even to acknowledge that the reason was not because of racism and sexism, but because of economic reasons, is viewed as racist. That argument is now inadmissible. And think about it. For a lot of people, if you're from a solid blue state like I am, solid blue coastal state like I am, you could probably sell that. A lot of people who just really aren't connected to the production economy that was really affected by immigration and free trade in the 90s. But a lot of those Rust Belt states, it's within living memory that people can remember when their parents, their mother, their father, or both were laid off from the factory, the plant, the mill. They remember the quality of life they had and the measure of security and dignity that came with it. And they remember when all those things went away. They remember watching their communities get hollowed out over 20 years. And while being told by Democrats, the problem was that it was their attitude and not the policy. And then they were told that if they didn't buy that, they were just bad people and they should go into that basket of deplorables. So when Trump came along and he started talking about those things, even clumsily and obnoxiously, those voters were all ears. Regardless of how he presented them, those stances were the reason many of them, their parents and grandparents, voted for Democrats in the first place. So now when somebody like Trump comes along and they're talking about how free trade and immigration isn't really the best thing for our economy and for our middle class, they're all ears. And then when you have the other candidate who just simply isn't willing to talk about those things, it's really no wonder that you had so many people in these states who voted for Obama twice and then they voted for Trump. Again, it wasn't because of racism, it was because of the economy. James Carville, it's the economy, stupid. And as if it was another year and Hillary Clinton was running against a normal establishment Republican candidate, she might have won because that establishment candidate wouldn't have been talking about these issues. The problem is that Trump had been a Democrat for like 40 years before he ran for president. And the few times that he talked about policy publicly, he advocated for what at that time was establishment Democratic stances on trade and immigration. And he brought those things right with him to the Republican Party when he won the nomination. He also made it more complicated because when he criticized trade and immigration, he did it loudly and crudely and in a way that was easy to attack. The line in the sand was drawn, and if you agreed with Trump on anything, you were a bad and dangerous person. If Trump was against open borders, like Bernie, open borders must be good. If Trump wanted enforcement of immigration law, well, naturally, immigration law and enforcement of it must be bad. If Trump is against mass migration must be good. These aren't thoughtful evolutions, they're thoughtless reflexes. As a result, millions of people ended up passionately fighting for policies that, had they been articulated calmly and compassionately by a less abrasive candidate, they would have agreed with them. So we can kind of see that in this election, it was just a massive gaslighting campaign. The Wesleyan Media Research Project points out that Hillary Clinton, not only were her ads not discussing any sort of policy, never mind economic policy, it noted that she wasn't really willing to talk about policy outside of the campaign ads either. So what were people voting for? What choice were they really being given? Now, if you get your news from one of the major news networks or maybe even the New York Times, you are probably being fed the same clips over and over again. And you're led to conclude by their analysis that, yeah, it's racism and sexism. But no, it's really about the economy. And the troubling thing for Democrats is that the swings in these elections also noted that a lot of minorities feel the same way. So the question we have to kind of tackle in the next video is, if Democrats aren't the party of the middle and working class anymore, who are they the party of? That's what we'll be talking about in part 3. If you like this video, hit like and subscribe. And if you didn't like it, I still suggest you hit like and subscribe. But also leave me a comment telling me why, or leave me a comment telling me why you agree with me, or if you've noticed the same things. What are the people around you saying? Because I can tell you, most of the people I talk to, friends and family, they didn't really see the objective reality in any of these things. Now, this is not to say that I am a Trump supporter or that I like Trump in any way. I'm just acknowledging the fact that his policies, a number of them, were the policies of Democrats for generations. They were the policies that big business was against, and they were the policies that benefited working and middle class people. And I feel the real danger that we're confronting now is the fact that Trump is for these things and has really kind of taken up the banner. And once he's gone, once he's off the table, and we have a new president, regardless of their party, these policies are not going to be at the forefront. The next president is, if they're Republican or a Democrat, they're going to talk about compassion. They're going to talk about opening up the borders. They're going to talk about getting more H-1B visas. And we're going to see another decline in wages and the economic security of our middle class. And we're going to be led into this new Gilded Age where, I mean, right now, in 1924, when they shut the borders down, the top 1% owned 45% of the wealth. I think right now we're just under 35% of the wealth. So as long as people don't understand these ideas and the reasoning behind them, they're just going to go with whatever team that they're a part of. If you're a Democrat, you blindly vote for the Democrat. If you're a Republican, you blindly vote for the Republican. If you're a Democrat, whatever view the Republican has on an issue, that's automatically bad, and vice versa. I think it's really important that we kind of divorce ourselves from this tribalism and look at things on a policy basis and really challenge the politicians to fuck their donors and listen to their voters. So that's it for this video. Again, hit like, subscribe, comment, and I will see you on part 3 where we'll talk about who the base of the Democratic Party is now.